I'm so delighted to welcome Billie Dunlevy, Integrative therapist and member of Counselling Directory. Welcome, Billie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here today.
Before we start, I'd just like to ask you to introduce yourself in your own words and tell our listeners a little bit about you and what you do.
As you mentioned, I'm an integrative counsellor or therapist. These are sort of interchangeable these days. And I work in private practice in northwest London, where I live with my dog Baxter. He's a miniature schnauzer, so he keeps me busy in between sessions. And I run a blended practice. So I work with clients in person, but also online across UK and Europe. I also write articles and blogs. I love to write. And I'm currently training for a new qualification, which is integrating mindfulness and compassion for professional practice as a mindfulness teacher with Mindfulness UK. So that's really exciting. I suppose, like a lot of professional helpers, I come to being a therapist after having my own transformative experiences in therapy. I'm a bit of what Carl Jung first coined a wounded healer, which basically means I've lived a life. I've had some tough experiences. I've had some wonderful experiences as well, but I didn't have a particularly easy early childhood. And so something about my own healing and wounding is what has drawn me to this profession. It's worked for me, so I guess I want to help others, to work through their own stuff. And it's a big driver for why I've chosen a career where I get to sort of be with others as they change and heal and grow.
Well, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for sharing your writing as well. As I mentioned at the top of the podcast, you are a member of the Counselling Directory and you've very beautifully written a number of articles on there. And I would encourage people to go and check them out, as well as your website, which we'll give at the end of the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about self-esteem. What is self-esteem? How do we define self-esteem and how does it relate to us personally?
Yeah, so self-esteem is a measure of how we value and perceive ourselves. It's fundamentally about our attitude and our belief towards ourselves and how much we like ourselves to some extent as well. It's a little bit different from self-confidence, although people kind of interchange these. Self-confidence is based more on external measures of success. So that might be about our faith in our abilities to, I don't know, sort of solve problems or land promotions, like give a dazzling presentation or something like that. But some people can actually have quite high self-confidence, particularly in one area of their life, but have an overall sort of feeling of low self-esteem about themselves.
That's so interesting, the difference between self-confidence and esteem, because I guess from the outside looking in, you could see someone who seems very confident, let's say perhaps at work, and you wouldn't imagine that perhaps they had low self-esteem because they seem so capable and confident. So I think making that differentiation is really important, isn't it?
It is, and also just a general reminder. Appearances are deceiving. We don't know what anyone is living through or what they have lived through based on how they show up. Because we all become very good at pretending or having masks or certain ways in which we behave in certain environments.
So let's talk about low self-esteem and what we might feel like if we have low self-esteem, and how can that seem to the outside world as well as our inner world?
Having low self-esteem, when we engage with it, it can feel really heavy and hopeless sometimes. When our self-esteem is low, we tend to have an overall negative view of ourselves, which can make us judge ourselves and speak to ourselves quite harshly. We can sometimes feel unlovable and incompetent, and often quite sort of worried and quite fearful of like making mistakes or letting other people down. So that's some of how it can feel, and how it presents to the outside world is very individual. Yeah. So I think just to talk through a few ways it could maybe show up. In my experience, quite a lot of us with low self-esteem spend a great deal of time trying to hide that we have low self-esteem, possibly from ourselves as well as other people. And people can do that by overcompensating in some way, So some people might, be overworking, people that are constantly busy. But then you get other people that have a presentation where they are quite avoidant of the world. They might be quite isolated, maybe avoiding relationships as well, because it's hard to be in relationships when we have low self-esteem. But also, as we were saying, someone with low self-esteem can seem completely fine to the outside world when life is going well. But then when the bumps come along on the road, which they inevitably do, the way they can sort of manage their often very high standards to sort of maintain their self-esteem can sort of crumble quite quickly. So I think people with low self-esteem, their self-image can be a bit precarious and not very solid. And also there's a lot of behaviours that can be linked to low self-esteem, like difficulty setting boundaries, trust issues, like trusting other people, but also trusting our own judgment. People pleasing is another one. And also comparing ourselves to others a bit obsessively. That can be another way that it can feel to have low self-esteem.
That's really useful, that overview. And also, as you said, very individual. So some people may be overworking, some people may be isolating themselves perhaps a bit more as they try to deal with that. Perhaps they feel like they can only present their very best selves to everyone. It's a tough one, isn't it? Low self-esteem, because it sits with you to manage. And I guess if you're in that place of low self-esteem, perhaps you're not at the point where you can address it. Is it something that we have power over?
I do believe that it is, and I think that that's the good news. We can do things to help cultivate a healthier self-esteem, but there are certain things that do determine it, certain mental health conditions as well, where that kind of, it can go hand in hand with it. But, all is not lost. We're not, it's not set in stone. Nothing really ever is. So there are definitely ways that we can engage with life in order to potentially improve our self-esteem.
I love what you just said there, that it's not set in stone, and very rarely something is, and there are things we can do. We said it's very individual, but I'd love to get your take on the prevalence of low self-esteem. So is this an issue you see a lot within your practice?
Yeah, it really is. And I think that's because low self-esteem presents in lots of reasons why people might come to therapy. It often underpins or can be intertwined with things like anxiety, depression, disordered eating, body image issues, relationship problems, growing up in a dysfunctional family, childhood trauma. So there's just so many things that, that it might be one of the ways in which it's showing up with. And when we have low self-esteem, I think it's important to say it can really feel like our lives are not our own. Like we have no control, that life just comes at us, and that can be really frightening, like to have no agency. And I think that's why, it is something that I see in practice. People need therapy or they need support to sort of manage that lonely state. And also our self-esteem, it can be really knocked by life events. As we've said, it's not set in stone. It's not like it's something we get as a kid and we're stuck with as is. I might see people in practice for things like they've lost their job, or they've become very ill, or they have had a breakup or divorce, or they're coming out of an abusive or controlling relationship. These are all things that can negatively impact our self-esteem levels.
Again, you just said that it can be something that's perhaps situational or brought on by a certain situation, and it's not necessarily something that just comes with us as part of our personality. It's something that can be developed over time. And have you seen any changes when it comes to low self-esteem in the time that you've been practicing?
I think it's just more prevalent, but I think that's because obviously post-pandemic, a lot of us through the pandemic, we were just surviving. We were just getting stuff done because we just had to sort of get on. But I think that now that it's over, there's a sort of message from society, like we're fine, we can go to restaurants and get on planes and everything's okay now. But what myself and a lot of my colleagues are seeing is actually we're at the sort of cascade end of the pandemic, and there's a lot of dawnings, and a lot of people they're exhausted, and also a lot of things have not been processed because we were just trying to survive. So yeah, I would say self-esteem is one of a myriad of things that I'm sort of seeing a bit more of.
That's such a realization, isn't it, that we're at the end of what was a massive trauma for everybody, and perhaps not everyone has processed it. And No, it's not like the world is in a completely steady state where we're
No,
at now.
exactly. There's a lot to be anxious about. There's a lot that can affect how we feel about ourselves because we don't live in a bubble. And yeah, we are at the end, but I think more accurately, we're actually at the beginning of the end because COVID is still a part of our lives, and who knows for how long it will be. I think everybody processes things at different stages, but I think unfortunately the pressure now to get back to life is often what's resulting in people coming to therapy because they're like, I can't, I don't know why, I don't, I'm not motivated, I don't feel good, so that might be a reason why they're showing up in practice.
You just mentioned the word motivation, and that's something we're also hearing quite a lot about, is people are feeling like they can't engage in the same way that perhaps they used to, that there's a lack of motivation, there's a certain lingering exhaustion, and there's a real deep questioning. Do you think that is something to do with the fact that we have been through such a period of survival?
Yeah, I do. But I also think that it's indicative of a problem societally where we have really low self-compassion. I mentioned at the top of this that I'm practicing in mindfulness compassion inquiry because we tend to blame ourselves for so many things, and as we're talking about, these things are deeply complex. There's so many factors that are not just about us, but we tend to blame ourselves or think we should be able to do better. I should be able to work a job, take care of my kids, socialize just as much, work on my self-development. Why would you be able to do all of those things when we're exhausted? We do lack self-compassion on a major level, and it's not all on us. There's societal things going on, there's societal oppressions, there's cost of living crisis, there's all kinds of things, and we're not superhuman, and neither should we have to be.
I feel like I need to take that snippet of you
Yes,
saying
me too. Me too.
and just replay it over and over again for everybody listening and myself. In terms of self-compassion, I'm really fascinated about your work in this area, and how it kind of intersects with low self-esteem, because as you said, we can be hard on ourselves, can't we? So part of the low self-esteem is also that lack of self-compassion. What is it that we're missing when it comes to self-compassion, and how can we start to embrace self-compassion in our lives?
I think that there's components to self-compassion. One is to be more mindful, and that's to be, we talk about mindfulness practice, but it's also to come off this autopilot and just notice, how am I feeling? Like, what do I need? What's going on? But the noticing without judgment, I think that's the sort of key aspect, as opposed to, oh, you shouldn't be doing that, you're so stupid, or any of that sort of. So monitoring our self-talk to some degree. And another aspect of self-compassion is recognizing that, we all suffer. We all do. And pretending that we don't doesn't help any of us. And actually, that sort of common humanity aspect of self-compassion is incredibly important. We are all going through something, or we all go through things eventually at one time or another. And so, we're not alone. I think that helps to cultivate more self-compassion as well. And self-kindness, and being curious about ourselves and offering ourselves care. These are some of the sort of pillars, if you like, of self-compassion. Yeah.
I love what you just said about being curious, and I wonder if we could delve a bit deeper into that when it comes to low self-esteem, because being curious to me is maybe gently interrogating why we're thinking what we're thinking. How can we do that for ourselves?
Yeah, so I suppose a component of low self-esteem is somewhere within a message that perhaps we have been told by others, or we tell ourselves eventually, that we don't matter, And so being curious is a way to show that we matter, trying to pay attention, what's going on there, what happened there, instead of kind of writing things off, or just being like, oh, this is just because this is the way I am, or not giving sort of attention. Kindly curious attention is a really a useful tool in cultivating more self-compassion, but also improving our self-esteem. It's essentially giving a shit about ourselves. It's it is, it's paying attention, and we all want to feel like we're being paid attention to, and it is something we can give ourselves. I think we need to check our self-talk. We need to not just let it run if we've got negative self-talk, because some people, they don't try to interrupt that, they don't counter it with another voice, which might be a little bit more compassionate or kind. And I think this also goes for sort of jokingly putting ourselves down in a kind of self-deprecating way. It's just really not helpful. So I do think that we have to pay attention to the way we think. But treating yourself like someone who matters, it is paying attention to it. If the fact that you talk to yourself quite badly, and ignoring that or trying to push it away or just accepting it as just the way things are, shows a lack of self-care to ourselves.
I agree. Could you tell me how working with a professional like yourself can help?
I think many of our personal wounds that cause our low self-esteem, they were created in relationships. So that with our parents, our siblings, friends, lovers. And because of this, we actually need a relational dynamic to help us sort of process and integrate and heal these things. And the relationship between a client and the therapist is really key to good therapy outcomes, but it can really teach a client a great deal about themselves, even though the relationship in therapy is professional and boundaried and structured. It can show us a lot about how we show up in all of our relationships. So it can be quite illuminating in that way, and that illumination is quite hard to get by ourselves. We sometimes need the other, we need another person. And also, depending on the reason why someone might have low self-esteem, working with professionals can sometimes be about grief work. For many of us with self-esteem issues, there's something lacking, or there might be a loss, there might be multiple losses. And so we have to grieve that. And that's a difficult thing to do alone. And it's a difficult thing to sort of unpick and define by ourselves. I also think that, for people with quite a strong adapted self, a kind of self that's a bit of a front or very for other people's benefits, making time, to come to therapy for 50 minutes a week, and it does take time to build trust, but they can find a space where they can drop all that, and they can learn what it's like to be themselves and how they can be themselves with another. And I think that good therapy is a place where we can learn not to pretend, and that's where the magic happens of really finding out who we are, what we're suffering with, what needs mended, what can't be mended, but also what we'd like, what do we want our future to look like, what's important to us.
That's beautiful. I think reassuring to anybody who is listening to this. I think one of the most beautiful things you said is the idea that you can come to therapy and actually make time for yourself and drop that front if it's something that you have been carrying for a long time. When you were saying that, I almost felt my shoulders drop. It feels like a space, therapy feels like a space where it is for you, which if you have low self-esteem, I would imagine you don't always put you first.
You don't. And also, and this is tough, you might not like you. You might not like you when you're not doing whatever it is that you do for other people. And that's why it's so important to be supportive and to have somewhere that's a caring environment where you're witnessed and you matter, regardless of these, tricky and low feelings. And so therapy is that place for many people.
And we absolutely champion people seeking out mental health support, but we also understand that it's not always easy in terms of access or financial
Absolutely,
access.
yeah.
So can we perhaps go back to what people can do for themselves?
It's the checking our self-talk. If we're constantly insulting ourselves in our heads and sort of letting this soundtrack run, it's going to have a negative impact on our mental well-being, our physical well-being. So treat yourself like someone who matters, someone you care about, and try to increase your self-compassion is a really brilliant way to improve that sort of inner critic. And an exercise, that people can try out is to actively treat yourself for the afternoon or something like you would a good friend who's in need of a little extra care. What would you do for them that you could do instead for yourself? This is easier said than done. I'm saying that to myself as I'm thinking about it, but it is really important. Is we have to learn to accept that mistakes and failures are part of life. you know. People with low self-esteem, when something goes wrong, they immediately blame themselves. There can be all manner of crossovers of responsibilities, stuff that has nothing to do with them. They take it incredibly personally, and they kind of pile in on themselves. So we need to learn to hold in mind that things don't work out for us all at different times in our life, and it's not a personal vendetta, from the universe. Our negative beliefs can make it feel like that, but that's not objectively true. So working on acceptance that things do go wrong and it's okay to fail. And there's ways you can do that. You can read about people, the most successful people in the world, have failed multiple times, and it can help to be reminded of that, because I think that we can get into a trap of believing that for others it's easy, everything just happens easily. Most stories of people's lives, there will be seasons of success and seasons where everything goes horribly wrong. Having a more balanced view around that, I think, is super helpful. The brain, annoyingly, has a negativity bias, which basically means that it sort of stores up and holds more negative experiences. So when we're working on our self-esteem, we really have to sort of counter that. And when we have low self-esteem, we tend to bat away compliments and, minimize any part we played in this good thing that happened. I know I've done it, and you'll hear people sort of saying things like, "Oh, it's not a big deal. Oh, I was in the right place at the right time," or "Oh, they're just being nice." And what this does is it sends a message to us that this lovely thing, this lovely nice thing, we did not contribute to it in any way. We are not significant. We do not contribute to the good things in life. So we need to big ourselves up. And that's something we can do more of. When something goes well, even if it's small, notice it, take in the good, and mark our achievements. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money, it doesn't have to cost any money, but just make a big deal when things go well and honor your part in it, because you do play a part in the good things that happen in your life. They're not just all happy accidents.
Billie, I think that is so true. And I wonder how many people are listening to you talking and nodding their heads, thinking, yep, I do that.
Yeah, I think it's natural. I think we all do it. But if you think about the way low self-esteem works, it tells us that every negative thing happens was us or our fault in some way, but all the good things had nothing to do with us, And so it's just about bringing a bit more balance back to that conversation. And society has markers. It sort of says we, especially as women, we celebrate babies and marriage or job promotions, but we get to decide what our markers are, and not everybody lives that sort of the same life. And so think about how you can celebrate yourselves and other people in your life. Have divorce parties, talk about doing nice things around things that are not necessarily the go-tos or the sort of things that we can easily hang these supposed celebratory moments on. We get to decide what matters to us, because we're all so individual, aren't we?
We really are. And that's such an empowering thought, that we get to decide what our markers are, because all too easily they are fed to us from a very early age.
And then when we don't meet them, it's like, oh, we haven't done good. But we get to decide what's good. We all have very different lives, and can have different lives and still lead really good lives, really fulfilling lives.
I think that's a major takeaway. Let's decide our own markers. Let's celebrate ourselves and help each other celebrate each other as well. I think that's an important thing.
Something else we can do is to make time for things we're good at. Mastery, being good at something, helps to improve our levels of self-esteem. And people might be listening to this thinking, I'm not really that good at anything. To which I would say, have you taken the time to find out what you like and what you could potentially be interested in and get good at? I think that low self-esteem and people pleasing goes really hand in hand. And so then for people pleasers, they're so other oriented. It's about what other people like or what they would want. So we really have to take a step back from that and find out, what do I like? what matters to me? What would I like to be more interested in? And this, comes back, Lucy, to that get curious. Show your self-care by being curious.
And those are great questions to ask ourselves, aren't they? What would I like? What would I like to be more interested in? Sitting down somewhere with a coffee and just taking yourself on a thought date, a curious date, and asking yourself those questions.
Yeah, and making the time for it, and because by constantly bypassing ourselves in our schedule, or not really taking time out. And I know people are busy, and they've got stuff they have to do, but by making yourself important, you are sending that very important message to yourself. I matter. I'm of value, and my value isn't not tied always to my doing. It's tied to my being. Like you say, I love that. Thought date. You can just go and sit in a coffee shop somewhere and watch people for an hour. If that's what you think will fill your cup, great, do it.
Sounds lovely.
Might do that this afternoon.
Sounds like the perfect way to spend a rainy afternoon, doesn't it? Is there anything else that you would like to share on the subject before we finish today's podcast?
Just one more thing, because it just feels like we have to mention it, and that is comparison, but particularly comparison online. In social media spaces for women, but for everyone, is just terrible for our low self-esteem. And so it's not to be underestimated in its power to really affect us. I think the brain, we know logically that what we look at online is a curated highlights reel. It's people's best bits, their best angles, their filtered skin. But, some algorithms in social media, they actually favor like announcement posts. So those things will be shown a little bit more regularly. And so content creators and normal people, they kind of get wind of that. And so it can sometimes feel like we're sort of living in this chamber of people constantly celebrating fantastic news. And if you feel low and you just have very low self-esteem, that is really detrimental to look at that constantly. And it can really affect how we feel about ourselves. So we all really need to start being more intentional with how we use social media, and notice. Again, it's that curious, notice when something makes us feel bad, and be intentional. We can hide people, we can mute people, we can have social media breaks, do whatever you need to make yourself feel a little bit better around social media use. But yeah, comparison and low self-esteem are really close cousins, if you like. And so, I don't know, we can't not ignore it, but it's not just somewhere we visit now, social media. It's somewhere where most of us live for parts of our time. And so even though we might be scrolling at quite a speed, these things are going in. They're saying stuff to us, So that's just another way that you can really take care of your own self-esteem.
That really rings true. For me personally, I definitely can sense when I have over-consumed social media that is not making me feel good. Yeah. And again, you said, you can hide people, you can unfollow them. You can also follow people who really pique those interests that you were talking about earlier on. So
yeah, that's a great point, Lucy. Yeah, curate it, build in those people you want to see, the people who it feels good, and oftentimes that's people who maybe show up in a little bit more real way. They maybe show some of the good, some of the average, and then that feels like it's more of a reflection of what real life is like.
Billie, I've loved speaking to you.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
I definitely think there are some really practical things in there that I would like to do. So we will make sure that all of that is in the article that goes along with this, which is on happiful.com. Again, Billie has a lot of brilliant articles on Counselling Directory, but I would also like you to share where people can find you online so they can read straight from you the work that you're doing.
Sure. So for sort of educational mental health posts and reels, you can find me on Instagram at The Relational Therapist. And from there, it links through to my website where people can find out more about working with me personally.
That's wonderful. We'll make sure that's in the show notes as well. And again, head over to happiful.com to read more about this interview. Billie, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. It's been great to talk. I've really enjoyed it.